Well, hello there. It is now 11 days since Easter, and it's easy to think, well, Easter's over. But for us Christians, it's not. In fact, it goes on until Pentecost in another 6 weeks' time or so. I want to talk today about the death and resurrection of Peter. And you may go, what? It was Jesus who died and rose again. Interestingly, around the death and resurrection of Jesus was woven another story, which I contend is the death and resurrection of Peter. So let's start with Peter's death. The Gospels tell us that when the Passover meal was over, the Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples sang a hymn and made their way out of town, across the valley, to the hill opposite, the Mount of Olives. As they trundled along, Jesus said to his men, "You will all desert me, you know." And Peter says, "Even if they fall away, I never will." And Jesus said, "To be honest, Peter, tonight, before the cock crows, that is, before morning breaks, you will have disowned me 3 times. And Peter says, of course, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And of course, they all said the same thing. So in time, Jesus was arrested and eventually taken to the high priest's house. And the text tells us that Peter followed at a distance. He stood outside by the charcoal fire, as many others did, waiting to see what would happen. When a woman looked closely at him and said, Aren't you one of his disciples?" No, I don't know him," said Peter. A little while later, a few people round the fire said, in a slightly stronger way, "You are one of his disciples, aren't you?" But again, he denied it. Still later, standing there with others, they all turned round and accused him, saying, "You are one of them. Your accent gives you away. You're a northerner." And another said, "And I saw you in the garden with him," the Garden of Gethsemane. He began to call down curses on himself. "I swear I don't know the man." And immediately the cock crowed. And we are told that Peter left the courtyard, went outside, and he wept bitterly. We have a progression here in these 3 denials: to a woman, to a group, and then to everybody. First it was a plea of ignorance, "I don't know him," then a denial, and then he swore an oath which Jesus said you must never do, that he never knew Jesus. And so Peter's death here is complete. All that Peter thought of himself, who he thought he was now dead. All that Peter would have others think and believe about him was now dead and gone. All that Peter had told Jesus who he was now dead. His well-promoted life came crashing down in those few minutes by that fire. So as Peter acts as a focus for the rest of the apostles, who did the same thing, of course, so he acts as a focus for us as well. All the disciples ran off, left Jesus, so denying him. And if we're honest, we don't live up to our statements or promises about faith or following Jesus. We don't live up to our own image of what being a Christian is. And as Peter's death reflects the many deaths that we suffer in life, so also, though, his restoration stands for our own healing and our own transformation. So let's turn to Peter's resurrection. We turn to John chapter 21, if you want to read the passage verses 15 to 19, one of my favourite passages from the whole of the Bible. And John, as he writes this, intends that John chapter 21 should be inseparable from the passage in John 18 where Peter denied Jesus. Both events are tied together by two things. First, the setting. Specifically, it says that they were by a charcoal fire in John 18 and in John 21. These are the only two places in the whole of the New Testament where the word for a charcoal fire is actually used. It's the word actually we get our word for anthracite from. I remember us having it in our boiler when we were kids. It's a particularly form of high density coal. So the setting is the same in both places. And the second thing which ties the two together is in both places, 3 questions are asked, and there are 3 answers. So, up in Galilee, back near home, Peter goes fishing with his friends because they can't think what else to do, I guess. It's another bad night in a bad season for them because they don't catch any fish. And in the morning when they're tired and worn out, there's a man on the shore. They don't know, of course, it's Jesus, but it is. And he says to them, throw your nets on the other side of the boat. And then there's an amazing catch of fish which is in danger of ripping their nets. John realises that this man is Jesus. And typically Peter jumps in the water and swims the 200 yards to shore to meet him. So Jesus has breakfast ready around the fire, this charcoal fire again, on the shore. And together they eat their breakfast. And then Peter wants a chat with Jesus. No, Jesus wants to chat with Peter. And what would you feel if Jesus wanted to chat with you if you had denied Jesus and turned your back on him and dished the dirt on him? I wonder whether Peter thought, I'm in for it now. Oh, I have to answer for myself. How can I explain myself? What can I say? And as the Elton John song says, sorry is the hardest flipping word, isn't it? And Jesus says, Simon, son of John, Simon Johnson, do you love me more than these? And Peter replies, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my lambs. He calls him to pastoral ministry. Secondly, he says, Simon, Simon Johnson, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, well, tend my sheep. The third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Now, at this stage, Peter was getting a bit narked because he'd asked him a third time, do you love me? Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep, says Jesus. Not once does Jesus expose the shame of Peter about what he had done. He ignores it. He covers it up. Well, there are multiple ways of looking at many passages, and there are with this one as well. But let me just highlight one of them to you. We only have one word for love in English. We have loads of words for rain, just as the Eskimos have loads of words for snow. The Greeks had far more words for love, and 2 of them are used, interestingly, in this passage. One of them you probably heard about is the word agape. It is that unconditional, no strings attached type of love, no requirements, no demands. It's just an unconditional, free-giving type of love. The other word used here is the word phileo, which means friendship or brother love. That's the sort of love we have in our families and our friendships. And there are demands and requirements on those, aren't there? It's not just no strings attached. And Jesus asks, interestingly, in this passage, he says, do you love me? And he uses the agape word. So he's saying, Peter, do you love me unconditionally with no strings attached? And Peter replies, I love you, but he uses the other word. He uses the friendship word. He said, I love you as a friend. Secondly, Jesus says, do you love me? Do you agape me with that no requirement, no demands love? And Peter replies, I love you as a friend. Thirdly, Jesus says, interestingly, do you love me, Peter, as a friend? And Peter goes, yeah, I love you as a friend. I think he's saying, this is the best I can do. If I'm honest, this is the best I can offer to you. I can't promise any longer things I can't deliver on. I can't promise to agape you. That is just, I can't do it. But he says, I can start by learning to love you as a friend, and let's see how we get on. And for Jesus, that's absolutely fine. You see, Jesus' chief concern is not right conduct or right behaviour. Faith is not first and foremost about morality. Jesus' chief concern is about love and right relating. If we love and relate in the right way, other things will then fall into place. Jesus, I think, is happy with Peter's realism. As I am at the moment, says Peter, this is what I can offer you. And Jesus says, that'll do fine. So death and resurrection isn't just about Jesus' final act of love, of death on Friday and resurrection on Sunday. It's also part of the pattern of life that we are invited into. And in fact, we are called to take up our cross daily and follow Jesus. It's part of something we're invited to do on a daily basis. Just as Peter died and rose again when he's on the shore with Jesus, so we're called to that same painful death and resurrection on a regular basis. In fact, death and resurrection is part of the pattern of everything in the universe. Living, dying, rebirth. Peter didn't like the dying bit, and I don't either, and I know you don't either. We don't like it in our personal lives when we don't live up to our own self-images, who we think we are. We don't like it happening in our churches when they're no longer like they used to be and something actually is lost. And we don't like it in our culture or our nation. And we start saying, it wasn't like this in the old days. And the coronavirus is a type of dying at the moment, I think, for our global society. And sadly for some people, it literally is their physical death. It's not the first time this sort of thing has happened across the world. And probably it's not the worst one we've ever had, but it is quite bad, of course, isn't it? For some reason, this is part of the pain of the universal pattern of living, dying, and rebirth. So the question is not, how do we find God despite the virus? But how do we find God even in the virus? Just as the faithful people realised in the gas chambers in the Second World War. Where was God? God was in there with them. As I come to the end of this little chat, let me say something about guilt. Peter was racked with guilt. He went outside and he wept bitterly. Well, there are two obvious forms of guilt I would mention. One is legal guilt with God. Basically, it's quite simple, really. The Bible says it quite plainly. We're all guilty and we're all forgiven. Done and dusted. Jesus says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So there we are. That's parked. That's sorted. What about feelings of guilt? We are such a guilt-ridden people. I once heard of someone who was a Jewish woman who married into a Christian family. And after a while she said, "You Christians, you're all so guilty all the time. Why is it?" And we could list loads of times when we feel guilt. Oh, we could have done more. If only we'd done more. We shouldn't have let our friend down. We really shouldn't have done that. Oh, the things I should have said to them before they died. It was our actions, it was my actions that broke up the relationship. Or we're not quite as good as other people. We don't, not quite as committed as them. Oh, we feel guilty about that. And then the classic ones. I don't pray enough. I don't witness enough. I don't work hard enough. I don't read my Bible enough. You can add your own feelings of guilt. I'm sure we could write a massive list about them all. And the feelings of guilt are different to that legal guilt. The feelings of guilt eat into us, sometimes making people take on far too much, makes some people overwork and makes them ill. For others, it paralyses them and causes great anxiety. And certainly it makes us feel bad about ourselves when actually God loves us. What was Peter's problem when he went outside and he wept bitterly? The problem was he had not lived up to his own image of himself. Sometimes we call it the false self. He saw himself as Peter, that new name he'd been given, which means the rock. Strong, dependable, faithful, fearless, better than the others, the number one disciple, the one who is loyal to the end. He would go down with the ship, as it were. But in those few minutes by the charcoal fire, he had proved himself wrong on all of these. His failure was there in his face for him and everyone and Jesus to see. The first and main reason he was sad, I believe, was that he was sad for himself. He hurt for Peter. The reason we feel so much guilt is the same thing. We find it impossible to live up to our own self-image, our own press, our own opinion of ourselves. I'm not usually the sort of person who would do that sort of thing or say that sort of thing. I was talking to a couple some years ago and the man had forced himself on his partner to have sex. And they asked me to see them the next day. And he said to me, "Oh, I'm not that sort of person. I don't know what came over me." He couldn't live up to his own press. We say, "I can't live with myself. I'm not like this. I shouldn't, I don't normally do this sort of thing." And then we say, "I can't face seeing that person again because of what I did." The implication being, of course, because I'm not really that sort of person. I've let myself down. And then we say, in effect, "Poor me, poor you." I don't think Jesus is at all interested, really, in our feelings of guilt. He doesn't seem to rate it, neither does the Bible either. He knows we will let him down. He knows we will let ourselves down, and he can deal with it. How? By forgiving us. So how do we deal with it then? Because it eats into us. There's only one solution. By letting go of our false expectations of who we think we are, our self-images of the sort of person we think we are, the sort of things we normally do. We need to let go of all that. It's rubbish. It makes us sort of feel pressure and this feelings of guilt when actually we don't do the sort of things we think we should be capable of doing. We're not quite as impressive, good or nice as actually we think we are. We don't have to be well respected and well thought of. God loves us. What does it matter what other people think? All we need to know is this, that we are loved and that we are capable of giving some sort of love back to where love came from. Not that we can do certain things, and not that we actually avoid doing certain other things. It's interesting to note that when Jesus asked Peter if he loved him, he used not his name Peter but Simon, before he was the rock, the fisherman, before he was the leader of the pack, before he was Jesus' right-hand man. Simply Simon, the working man he'd met 3 years earlier. Simon. Below the title, Rev, I'm a Rev. Doesn't matter, doesn't mean anything. All the titles that you've had, all the things that you have done, they don't mean anything really. Because ultimately, what makes you who you are is that you are a loved person by God. And the invitation is to give a bit of that back to where it came from, to God, as best as we can do. Today, God calls you and me, not just ministers, not because we're talented or gifted, not because we have a good track record, not because we have amazing spiritual lives, but because we are broken and vulnerable enough to say, we'll try and love you as best as we can do, but no more promises than that. Nothing else is needed. Do I love him? I'm not sure, but I'm giving it a shot. Let me close with this short prayer by Thomas Merton. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think that I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore I will trust you always, even though I may seem to be lost in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Amen.